Okay, great. So it's my pleasure to introduce Harrison Ritz. Before getting his PhD at Brown University, he completed his Bachelor of Science at Queen's University and his master's at the University of Western here with our own Ingrid Johnstrom. Currently, he's a CV Star Fellow at Princeton Neuroscience Institute, where he works with Jonathan Cohen and Nathaniel Duh. His research investigates the dynamics of cognitive control, such as attention decision strategies, through the lens of optimal control theory. Please join me in welcoming Harris.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be a part of this series. There's been excellent speakers so far. I went back and watched a couple of videos and I really liked them a lot. And I'm excited to tell you about this project that I've been working on the last couple of years. All right. So, cognitive flexibility is critical not just for human flourishing, but for our everyday life. Say that you're at SFN, you're chatting. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. You're chatting with a friend, maybe you're catching up on current events, and you see that another friend is coming over to join the conversation. Based on that cue, you can rapidly reconfigure and switch languages so you can catch up with that friend as well. Now, existing cognitive theories over the past, let's say, 30 years have kind of really actively debated the component processes that are involved in this task preparation. And one theory says that there really isn't much to preparation. It's mostly that there's interference from the previous trial. And so kind of canonical example is that people find it difficult to switch between tasks just arises from some basically priming that kind of passively diffuses from the previous trial. And another group have proposed that an important process is that there's this active preparation, deployment of cognitive control that maybe suppresses the previous representation and loads in some new representation. And, in the strongest version of these, once it's loaded in, then you can start to kind of engage with the trial. Now, these factors have been central to two different kinds of theories about how people switch between tasks and what drives their performance. But at least people think that these are two kind of separate and distinct factors that contribute to task switching. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a kind of a new view on this process that kind of combines these two different processes into using a kind of novel neural motif that we call neutral state preparation. I'm going to tell you a lot about why we think this is the case and how this kind of changes the views of these classic theories and long-standing debates in our field. And the way I'm going to answer this is by formalizing these cognitive factors in a somewhat unusual way. What we're going to do is, instead of kind of baking into the architecture what we think these factors should entail, we're going to bake into the training regimes of kind of generic neural networks. And we're going to kind of build out different sets of neural networks that are going to kind of capture the influences of interference and preparation on task preparation. And once we have these trained neural networks, we're going to model the dynamics in these neural networks using a kind of state space modeling approach that we think gives a high degree of interpretability to their underlying dynamics. We're then going to apply this same state space modeling approach to human brain recordings with EEG across two data sets. And then we're going to see which of these factors kind of best accounts for the kinds of latent neural dynamics that we see in the human brain. So let me tell you a little bit about how we trained these neural networks. This is going to be kind of a variation on a kind of classic paradigm. I should have a citation to Manti and Cicillo because this is a foundation for this work. We're going to have recurrent neural networks, and they're going to have gating architecture as well. Excuse me. And on each trial, the networks are going to be given a cue. They got two different cues to tell them to do task A or task B. And since they've been cued to do task A, they're going to have to make a judgment for whether or not two subsequently presented inputs differ in their amplitude. And because they were not told to do task B, they're going to ignore to other inputs and not respond based on the contrast between those two stimuli. And in order to train these networks, during this kind of task period, first they're going to get a delay, first they're going to get a queue, then have a delay period, and then they'll perform this judgment. We're going to, reward them for how close they get to responding to the correct action here. 1 is greater than 2. You can see that up here, this cyan line is greater than this green line. Okay, so this is exactly the mantis task, I guess, with the addition of this delay. There's a paper with, I think it's Stiegel, Bushman, Miller that does this kind of task instead, but it's a close variation on this context-dependent decision-making paradigm that's been popular in training neural networks. Okay. And so how are we going to use this paradigm to study these different kinds of cognitive factors that we think are involved in task switching? The first way is we're going to compare networks that have and have not been trained to switch tasks as a model of preparation. And so, we're going to train one pool of networks that have not been trained to switch between tasks. They're going to do the vanilla mantis task their entire life. And we're going to compare that to another pool of networks that, for the first 90% of their life, have just done this basic one trial task. And then the last 10% of their life, they're going to be trained on these concatenated pairs of trials. And so we're interested in, we want networks that are can both make decisions and can both do the basic task relatively well. And we want to see what is the kind of extra thing that you get when you now have to sequence multiple trials together. And we're going to then test both of these networks on 2 trial epochs to see how well they can do. And so again, we're thinking that this is our instantiation of what is it that you learn when you have to sequence tasks, and that will be this kind of active preparation process.
Harrison, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
The task that the network has is to answer the question, is stimulus A bigger than stimulus B, and it's across a whole set of time periods. So is it some average, or is it the last data point, or what's
No, it's going to be integrated over an epoch. We give them 10 time steps where they're not penalized for their response, and then the remaining 30 time steps, we're just going to sum up the log likelihood of the correct response.
All right, thanks.
Using binary cross entry.
Can I ask another question here?
Yeah, sure.
So for the 2 types of tasks, you have 2 different stimuli, right? 2 different types. Basically, you have 4.
That's right.
Stimuli, right? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good. Okay. And so the second cognitive factor was this interference from the previous trial. And the kind of classic way that this was studied in the kind of original papers was varying the intertrial interval, or the time between the previous trial and, let's say, the queue for the next trial, and finding that this had a substantial effect on people's ability to switch between tasks. And so we're going to perform the same manipulation in these neural networks, where now we're going to train another pool of neural networks that in which they have a longer ITI. They have this longer gap between trials. And so if there is some kind of passive diffusion of a previous task state, that will be more diffused over that kind of longer ITI according to these existing theories. And then again, we're just going to test these pools of neural networks on these long ITI test trials. And so in this way, we're going to kind of have manipulations for both of these 2 cognitive factors. And we're going to train big pools. We're training 512 RNNs with different seeds to perform these tasks. Okay. And so what we see is that, maybe unsurprisingly, these networks, learn to do well. Up top in this green, we can see networks that are 2 trial networks that have been trained to do 2 trials. And we can see they have quite similar performance on the first trial. All networks have lots of experience in doing this basic task. But on a second trial and on a new third trial that no one's ever been trained on, we see that they do much better on these subsequent trials than networks that had not been trained to do multiple tasks. And we can get some kind of measure of reaction time. Is there like the time steps until they first pass 60% accuracy? And we see a similar kind of story for this reaction time measure as well. Now we've looked a little bit at what parts of the network seem to be important for this. I'll show you one. This is just a basic ablation. So if you've never had update gating, or you've never had reset gating, or you're just an RNN, the critical part for this GRU seems to be having this update gate. And it does appear that update gating is helpful for both kind of learning the original task and for getting this extra bump when you go into this two trial learning, suggesting that this kind of ability to gate in and out information, which is some relation to ideas about cognitive control, is helpful for this kind of sequential decision-making process.
Harrison, what's preventing the networks from getting to 100% accuracy?
There's a lot of,
noise?
yes, I think they're overtrained a little bit, and there's noise. There's not noise here. When we do so we don't have a separate test set because they see all the conditions. And so we run them without noise for test, which is a weaker test, but you can see here in the black, they still show overfitting over this time period. And so this is what we used. I think it's hard to switch between tasks, and I think that they're trained to accumulate evidence over time, and that the stimulus might be ambiguous. It's a question. We've been looking at loss for a long time, and we've just started to look at accuracy, and it's smaller than I thought it was going to be.
I mean,
But
even
this is also a difficult task. Yeah.
even just when there's one trial and no switching, I don't understand why an RNN can't learn to integrate two quantities and say which one is bigger.
Yeah. In their training, the noise is very high. We're at like negative 16 decibels in the training. We train them at an extremely high amount of noise to really put a pressure on them to like form a good task representation and do the task well. Now they're tested in zero noise, but maybe being trained under such a high degree of noise encourages certain kinds of biases. That'd be my guess. Okay. Now we can do basic dimensionality reduction, and we can see that there's some nice structure to their latent activity. But before we get too excited about that, I want to talk about how we're actually going to kind of quantify these latent dynamics and compare these to EEG. And so what we're going to do is we're really interested in this preparatory period. At the onset of this second trial, what is happening right from the time point that you're cued to the kind of earliest period of the trial that you're not even making a decision yet, but you've just kind of seen the onset of the stimuli. And so we're really keen on what's happening during this kind of preparatory period that in motor control studies have cared a lot about as well. And the kinds of things that we want a statistical representation to have is, one, we want it to be powerful. We want it to capture the data distribution so that we can use it as a surrogate for our analyses. We want it to be interpretable, and that often means linear. And we want it to be general. We want it to be an approach that we can use both in the RNNs and in the EEG so that we can do apples to apples comparisons. And so the approach that we've been taking is to use these linear Gaussian state space models. And this is an approach that's kind of popularized by people like Yakomaki and Liam Basinski, I think. No, Jonathan Pill uses these models a lot. They've been used a lot in computational neuroscience, but they've had less, I'll say, kind of influence on neuroimaging in humans. And so the basic model is very similar to something like factor analysis. So we're going to observe a time series of hidden unit activity. Here we're going to do PCA first as a pre-processing step, but we're going to keep 99% of the variance. So we're really not using this for dimensionality reduction too much. So we're going to observe a time series of RNN hidden unit activity, and we're going to try and find a set of latent factors that have a linear relationship to this hidden unit activity. And we can pick as many latent factors as we want, and we'll see in the next slide how we pick that. And kind of this would be kind of close to standard factor analysis. And the differentiation here is that we're going to assume that there's some kind of recurrent dynamics or autocorrelation in these latent factors, but critically not in the data. And that there's inputs that are going to reflect the different kinds of components of the task, what tasks they've been told to do, what was the previous task they were told to do, and just a contrast between is it switch versus repeat, which is like the interaction. Now, we're treating this as a statistical model. This is kind of a souped up GLM for our purposes. And so in order to give us kind of a little more flexibility for this model, we're going to infer time varying inputs within each trial, or time varying inputs over the epoch. They're going to be the same for all of the trials, using a spline basis function. And we've developed kind of a procedure for fitting these state space models in Julia that kind of combines kind of good initialization, which is really important, and an expectation maximization procedure. We've got this pretty well tuned where this can fit in about a day. But these models are kind of gnarly to fit. If anyone's interested, we have a package on GitHub and on the Julia general registry. And so how well do these models do? The first thing we want to ask is, how many latent factors do we need to explain the neural activity? And I want to say before I show you, it's not that we're interested in like, what's the dimensionality of the neural data, but for a linear system that's trying to capture an underlying nonlinear process, what kind of dimensionality do you need? And what we found is that the best fitting models for held out test accuracy have many more factors than latent dimensions. And so, when we do PCA, we go from about 100 units to about 50 units. And we see that the best fitting latent models have, or the models with the best fitting models, according to the latent factors, have more latent factors than the number of original units, not to mention the number of principal components that we're now using. So it's really these over-parameterized linear models that seem to have the best performance. And this is consistent with some kind of exciting recent, somewhat recent work in like control theory and dynamical systems theory, suggesting that big delay embedding matrices are able to linearize quite complicated, even chaotic nonlinear systems. And so we see that these over-parameterized models do the best job. We see that their performance is actually quite good. We see, even, looking forward more than half of the duration of the epoch, where we have quite good predictive accuracy in held out data. And kind of critically, and what we would not get with a kind of traditional black box approach, is that we have quite good parameter recovery. So here we can take a model that we've fit to RNNs, and we can generate data from this fitted model with known parameters. And then we can see how well can, when we then take that synthetic data set and feed it through our fitting procedure, how well can we recover the parameters, I'll say up to an invertible transformation, which is necessary because it's a latent variable model. And so we see that we are able to do quite well, and that we have a model that we should be able to kind of look at and understand the parameters for. And so we've done this in the RNNs, and we promised that we would do the same thing in EEG as well. And so we've looked at two existing data sets, and we're really grateful for these authors, Sam Hall-McMaster and Stéphane Arnaud, for making their data open source. And these two EEG data sets have a similar kind of structure where you're going to get a cue for what task you do, you'll have a delay period, and then you'll perform a trial. And just like in the RNNs, there's going to be a 50-50 switch versus repeat rate. And both of these experiments have this basic structure. They differ in a bunch of other aspects. Hall-McMaster has 60 channels, Arnaud has 128. They differ in the specific tasks here. Hall-McMaster is doing a discrimination task, and Arnaud is doing a search task. But the kind of key difference between these studies that we were interested in is they substantially differ in their ITIs. The Hall-McMaster is like 2.5-second ITIs, and the Arnaud has like 800 millisecond ITIs. And so there's almost a threefold difference between these ITIs, exactly the same ratio that we trained these RNNs in. And so these long and short ITI RNNs have the same ratio as our two EEG data sets. And so we can take this EEG signal and we can do the same latent variable modeling and linearize the dynamics from the voltage recordings of the EEG electrodes. And when we use this same tool in EEG, we see that, again, these overparameterized models perform quite well. Here, when you do PCA on EEG data, kind of no matter how many channels you start with, you really get something like 17, 18 principal components for capturing 99% of the variance. But again, it's these high dimensional models that really do the best for held out accuracy. And the best performing model is this 112 model. And we can compare this to a couple of sensible null models. So here for this R squared, we've normalized it against an autoregressive encoding model. And so that's just taking the principal component time series and fitting an autoregressive model that has the same kind of complicated spline input function and the same multivariate likelihood. And we see that we capture 90% of the variance that's unexplained by just an autoregressive model at the level of the principal components. And so there is something extra about having these kinds of latent dynamics. For example, they can have dynamics in the null space that are more expressive and not strictly Markovian. We can compare more complicated models than linear state space models. And so we train recurrent neural networks to just predict next time step voltage. And we see that we outperform these neural networks when they're matched for the same number of parameters as our linear Gaussian state space models. And so we think that we're in a regime where we're doing a relatively good job capturing the variance in this data set, and kind of gives us some more faith in using it as a surrogate for subsequent analyses. We see that these models predict quite well. We capture 99% of the variance in the reliable 99% of the noise ceiling of the power spectrum in held out data. Again, for these EEG data, we see that we have a very good parameter recovery. And so now we've got a model that we can fit to RNNs and we can fit to EEG. They fit well in both cases. They seem to be relatively interpretable in both cases. How can we use them to kind of pick apart the control signatures in our theory and see whether or not that these show up in our data as well? And so a kind of trick that we're going to use throughout is going to be based on the kind of maybe the best property of our linear systems. And that's the following: is if you had a linear dynamical system with 3 different inputs, you could decompose that into 3 linear dynamical systems, each with just 1 input. You could roll out those systems, and if you added them back together, you would get the original system. This is just the superposition principle of linear systems. And what that means is that we can simulate from our model what would the trajectories look like if the only input was task input. And we can isolate what are the task-specific dynamics and the task-specific states that that occur during the epoch of interest. And that would be factorized from the kind of baseline activity or from other kinds of confounds that we might have in our GLM. And that's nice because that's not something that we could trivially do with a nonlinear system. For this first kind, so this kind of task state is something we're going to use throughout. For this particular analysis, we're going to look at what is the kind of strength of task encoding over this epoch. And we're going to adapt a metric from control theory based on controllability. And we're going to turn this into a time-varying metric that's going to tell us over time how much covariance in the system is attributable to these inputs. And I really like this as a measure of neural encoding in RNNs, but also in EEG, because it accounts for 2 different things. Our measures of encoding and decoding shouldn't just care about how strongly does a population encode something right now, but it should matter a little bit if those neurons are in a network hub that can then distribute that information to other areas. And so it's important to have an account of this recurrence and how this encoding is, spreads and is amplified over time. And so what we see when we look at this metric, we're going to compare switch versus repeat trials to see whether or not there's this elevation of control energy when neural networks switch between trials. This is a kind of basic prediction from the preparation account. And we see that this is the case. So these two trial networks that have been trained to switch between tasks kind of over the entire epoch, or broadly over the epoch, show this elevated task energy when they have to now switch between tasks. So switching doesn't just make it harder, but they also kind of do more in order to compensate for the fact that they need to switch.
You haven't told us whether the RNN shows any switching cost behaviorally. Is there anything? I mean, it didn't look like, we couldn't see it in your.
Yeah, I didn't show that. So one kind of funny thing about the RNNs is the switch costs they show are quite weak. So for neural networks that have not been trained to switch between tasks, they show massive switch costs. That's one of the biggest contributors to their overall poor performance. For neural networks that have been trained to switch between tasks, they show quite small switch costs. They are there and they're present in the data. The switch costs are stronger when you have a shorter ITI, but they show, I'll say, modest to small switch costs.
Human switch. What are the human switch costs roughly?
I have to go back. I haven't gone back and compared the two studies. I think both studies find a signature for switch costs. Often these experiments will have quite short ITIs, shorter than I think what they've used here. But there are switch costs in both of these experiments. I'll talk a little bit about that, I think, at the end, because I think this kind of points to other kinds of contributors at the time of the decision that might contribute to those behavioral signatures, rather than those behavioral signatures being a gold standard of preparation. I think would be kind of the strongest interpretation for our findings. But it's a question that I've been wrestling with a lot, I'll say.
Don't you see it even in the reaction time?
Sure. In humans, yeah, for sure.
In the model.
I don't think I've looked at reaction time. The reaction time measure is not a very good measure. They're not committing to a response. They're just accumulating evidence over time. And so I'd have to find a way for them to set an optimal threshold. And I don't think that's critical for what we're looking at. Okay, so we see there's this increase in task energy when these neural networks have to switch between tasks. And we see this same signature in human EEG as well. And now we can, directly compare the RNNs and the EEG. And these are, bootstrap confidence intervals. And we see that there's a much better alignment between these switch-trained RNNs and the human brain in terms of the task energy that's deployed when they switch tasks relative to repeat tasks. And this is our first signature this is our first suggestion that there's this extra kind of preparatory process is critical for capturing human neural activity. And so, we've kind of looked at what's the magnitude of task encoding, and now we want to look into the geometry. And so in order to understand the geometry, we're going to look at cross-legged similarity. And so that's just looking at what's the similarity between the task state at every time point on the repeat trials to every time point on switch trials. And so for one trial RNNs that have not been trained to switch, we see this negative alignment. There's this tug of war in the task representations between switch trials and repeat trials. By contrast, when we look at these neural networks that have been trained to switch between tasks, we see this quite strong alignment in the task representations between switch and repeat trials, and this kind of striking difference between the ITI length. And so when you have a long ITI, you kind of have this similar trajectory or the similar state across the kind of entire epoch between switch and repeat trials. And when you've only got a short ITI, you see they kind of start in this kind of competitive state, and that it's only until later on that you really reach a kind of common state um, when you're switching versus when you're repeating.
Harrison,
And
what
so
is-
here we see this kind of very striking difference between our RNNs that just depends on the ITI. Sorry, was someone saying something?
Yeah, Harrison, what are the rows of those heat map matrices?
The rows are different time points for the repeat trials.
Oh, it's time.
Or sorry, the rows are different time points for the switch trials, and the columns are different time points for the repeat trials. And so it's taking every time point on a switch trial and getting the cosine similarity with every time point on a repeat trial. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear.
Thank you.
And they are negative on I mean, what's the cosine similarities are just across all hidden units.
This is in the states. This is in the factors that we estimate using the state space model. But yes, they're negative, and I think it'll become clear why in the next slide.
And so why is the single trial RNN like throughout negative?
I think it's going to be more clear on the next slide when I can show you the traces. And so we see this very different signature between one trial and two trial neural networks. And when we look at the EEG, it shows this striking resemblance to these switch-trained RNNs. And again, the switch-trained RNNs are a better model of the activity with, kind of no alignment necessary between theory and data. And so we had the same question that maybe Jorn's having, which is why is it that not just that there's these different signatures between networks that have been trained to switch and not, but that there are these major differences that depend on the ITI. And so we can go back and we can look at, now we're back into the original hidden unit RNN activity, and we can do dimensionality reduction and kind of plot it for an example network. And we can see that for this network on a switch trial, and this network's been trained to switch between tasks, that on the first trial, let's say it's doing task A, it'll kind of have dynamics that come around like this. During the ITI, it will cut in to the middle of the state space. And then in the second trial, it'll kind of loop around and mirror the trajectory that it would have taken if it had started doing task B from the beginning.
What is the initial point, the white circles?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
What is the initial points on those red task B, trial one? And task
They're
B?
initialized near the origin, and we find similar results if we train the initial conditions.
No, he's asking where do the traces start?
Yeah, like at what time point?
At time 0. This is showing 2 trials of the...
The open circles is the beginning?
Yes, the open circles are the beginning. Look, these arrows have pointers on them.
Yeah.
And so the open circle, they come this way, and then they cut into the middle, and then they come around.
Right.
Okay?
Is that
So yeah,
huge?
these open circles all these networks are always initialized at the origin. But it doesn't really matter where you initialize them. Okay? And so what we see is that during the ITI, these networks that have been trained to switch between tasks converge into the center of the state space. And this is when you have a lot of time during that ITI. If you don't have so much time during the ITI, it appears like you don't make it all the way there. That means that in those early time points of that second trial, you're going to be going in opposite directions, which we think produces this negative alignment in the states. No, they'll be on other opposite sides of the origin. And so we can quantify this convergence just to see, do neural networks converge into a similar state? This is a kind of maybe a simplified version of this. We could do the full like Slow-Routine nonlinear analysis, but we just look to see whether or not the Euclidean distance between these states decreases during the ITI for after you've done one task compared to after you've done the other task. So regardless of which task that you start with, maybe you've started over here in red and you're going this way, or you started over here in blue and you're going this way, does the Euclidean distance just drop over time? And we see that this is the case much more strongly for neural networks that have been trained to switch between tasks. And we can compare this to neural networks that have not been trained to switch between tasks. And what we see is that during that ITI, there's some kind of dynamics, not all networks show this, there's some kind of dynamics that go a little bit towards the middle, and then they just try and, shortcut and beeline right to the kind of terminal task state when they start to do that second task, and they do quite a poor job of it. Okay, and so we see that there's this convergence in the state. And what we were curious was, is this convergence into a task neutral state? Are they resetting into a state that's somewhere in the middle of the task space relative to the kinds of states that they need to perform the task? And this would seem to be kind of a sensible strategy for how one might perform this task. And so we derived a midpoint score that I'm going to show you on the SVD, but we are actually going to use for the on the state space analysis. And the midpoint score is simple, is if we look at every time point during the epoch, during this second trial, again, that we're interested in looking at, what's the relative Euclidean distance to the initial conditions? And so like early on in the trial, I'm closer to the task that corresponded to the task that I was doing previously than the task that I'm switching into. And so there's a big difference in these Euclidean distances, where kind of later in the trial, there might be a smaller distance in these Euclidean distances, and they might become more similar. They might become equal. And when the Euclidean distance is equal, that means that I'm at the midpoint between these two states. And so for one trial RNNs that have not been trained to switch, we see that they're far from the midpoint of the task space throughout the epoch. So they never really recover into a task neutral state, which would be a midpoint score of 0. In contrast, we see that these neural networks that have been trained to switch between tasks, the initial conditions seem to be somewhere that's quite close to the state that they're in, as they're performing the actual task. And we can see that when they have a longer ITI here in purple, they get closer to the midpoint than when they have a shorter ITI. And so, by the end of that ITI, they've gotten closer to the task midpoint, suggesting that that's what they're converging into, consistent with the kind of convergence analyses that we saw in the previous slide. We can do the same analysis in the EEG as well, and we show a striking similarity to these switch-trained RNNs. Like these switch-trained RNNs, it appears that the initial conditions of the EEG signal are quite close to the midpoint of the kind of state that they're going to be in when they perform this task. And again, these RNNs capture about half the variance in this midpoint score. Okay, so where we started was this account where there's these two different factors. One is this passive interference, and the other is this active preparation that occurs critically when I've been queued for the task that I have to do. And we kind of reinterpret both of these factors. One is this interference does not appear to be passive, but appears to reflect the control dynamics during the ITI that reset the system into a neutral state. And that preparation does not just start at the queue, but it's kind of happening throughout. It's not that we just sit in one task state and then leave it when we're told to, but where these task representations are constantly evolving over time in order to kind of flexibly respond to the structure of the task. And our new interpretation is that this might be something analogous to a tennis player, where after they make a rally, they are going to recover back to the center of the court so that they're best able to respond to whatever direction their opponent hits back to. And on top of this, when they actually do get that cue, they're going to have this kind of elevated control on these switch trials. And so we're very excited about the kind of future of this kind of program. One kind of direction that we're looking at next is I've almost finished collecting an OPM MEG data set, and we're excited about the potential to use this state space modeling approach to kind of enhance our ability to do source reconstruction and look at the distribution of task representations over time across the brain, which we couldn't localize in this experiment. And on a slightly longer horizon, we're interested in trying to build out kind of process models for these latent dynamics using inverse optimal control. And that's work that's kind of coming up in the spring. I'm going to be doing a Connected Minds fellowship back up in Toronto with Gunnar Blum. And we're excited to look at how we can try and recover the causes of these latent dynamics that we previously inferred, building on kind of new kind of control theory methods that we've been developing. All right, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I have a question about the way you trained the two task networks. Were those ones always exposed to these? Did they always knew that there was a second task coming?
Which the two trial networks? No, so
Yeah.
for the first 90% of their training, they just got a single task. And it was only that last 10% of training that they had this experience with two trials in a row. But I'll say that all of those trials, we fully blocked it. All of those trials had two trials in a row.
Yeah, I was curious whether this strategy that the network came up with to kind of get to that midpoint and make that transit had to do with the fact that, well, the degree to which it had to do with the fact that there was a secondary task coming. I might have missed something in the
No, you're right.
Yeah.
We see that in their performance, they don't sacrifice performance on that first trial. And so it's not coming at the expense that we were wondering whether or not that would be the case.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be the case that they sacrifice performance on that first trial. I think it's an interesting question of how it would look if we interleaved it instead of blocked it. A lot of the design decisions here were to match the EEG, and we don't know the extent to which people have, long blocks of switching versus, rapidly interleaved switching. There's different learning rules. There's things that make training an RNN different than the timescales of learning for a person. And the goals really for the RNN was to was almost like rational analysis. Like, can we find a optimal strategy in the sense that it's the output of an optimizer, and see whether or not that's a good explanation for what we see in people.
It's
a
not
good
a
question.
related question. In the two task version, the RNN in the intertrial interval, it kind of hung out in this midpoint region.
That's right.
Why didn't it just go back to the initial position? I mean, from the network's point of view, from a task point of view, it's the same as the initial condition. Is it because the network was always trained on two consecutive tasks? Is it sort of tracking time through task?
I don't think going to the initial conditions would be that good of a strategy, because there's some trade-off of like how much travel time it's going to take me to get back to those initial conditions, and then, pardon me, how much travel I'll have to do along the kind of task trajectory from that initial condition.
In that initial condition, it could be task 1 or task 2, right? In principle, the first one could be A or B, and then the next one could be A or B. And so after you've done A, it's still going to be
go
A
back.
or B. So I mean, in terms of the task, it would. I'm just curious if my instinct is it's tracking kind of there's some kind of constant shift along a direction that's tracking task stage. And that middle, if you had introduced a version where there's now 3 tasks, interval task 2, interval task 3, I bet it would hang out at a different intermediate stage in between task 2 and task 3.
Yeah, that's a critical test for the EEG. I think you're absolutely right that is an important thing that we need to do an EEG study on, or an MEG study on, is how do people switch between 3 tasks. And if they know they're going to switch between task and A, do they hang out in that midpoint? And if they know they're going to switch between B and C, do they hang out in that midpoint? I think that would be an important test. Yeah.
The other prediction would be maybe if you decrease the dimensionality of your network,
Yeah.
you would see that midpoint getting closer and closer to the starting. Something
The
like
origin. I think part of this might be how the training decision that we made, because we initialized at the origin, the you can't see in the SVD, but the biggest dynamics, that singular vector one, is they do a big jump to get into a part of the state space that has whatever interesting compartments that they can use for task processing. And so I think the origin's maybe not the most exciting part of the state space in terms of the nonlinear flexibility or something of the model. And so it's not necessarily the best place to return to. If that's helpful. Yeah.
one question following that. Do you see if you do it, if you're doing a task on the second trial, is it going back to the dynamic of that task as if it was on the first trial? Is it like,
Yes, yeah, that's exactly what we found.
Oh.
Or it's doing something that looks like those dynamics here. I'll pull up in the paper we just show the whole thing, and that maybe would have been helpful at a point in this. But if you can look, here's a great example. This kind of bottom here is that they're going to do one trial, and here they're going to repeat, and they're going to come back, and they're going to, it looks like maybe they're on a line attractor or something. They're going to like repeat that trajectory again. And here, when they switch, they're going to come around and they're going to jump all the way over, but then they're going to be back on this train track for the second trial. And so I think, yeah, they might be going somewhere that's like the origin, but it might not be worth going all the way back to the 0, point. If you only have you only have some amount of time during that period.
So
That's my guess.
related to these, have you tried a 2-trial version of a non-switching task? So you always do task A, but it's 2 trials.
So it's
thinking
only
that in that
repeat
scenario,
training?
you also go to 0, again, and it's going to become similar to the 2-trial switching task. Because in the 1-trial case, you're just done. Like after 1 trial, you know that you don't have to go back. And as you said, when you see this new trial coming in the test cases, you suddenly in one time sample go through the initial condition, initial state again.
Oh, I just want to be clear. These dots are not single time points. These
No.
dots are like okay, yeah, big yes. If I train them only on repeating, that is interesting control. Yeah, I think that they would come back to somewhere earlier, like you're saying, somewhere earlier in this trajectory, and then loop back around. And that would also look very unlike what we see in the EEG. Right? Because they wouldn't return to the midpoint like we see in the EEG. And so it would be a good control, but it would be, I think we both have the intuition that it would be confirmatory with our neural findings.
I had a question about, I just maybe missed this, but I understood that the data sets, when it says short and long ITI,
Yeah.
were these things blocked as well? Did the network and or the people certainly knew because there were different experiments, right?
They're different experiments, and they had the same, well, they have a little bit of jitter on the ITI, but right, in the short ITI experiment, they did like 800 to 1,000 milliseconds, and in the long ITI experiment, it was like 2 to 2.5 seconds or something like that.
And when you trained the network,
Yeah.
did it know were the ITIs consistent across regions?
Yes, the ITIs were consistent within a pool of RNNs.
It's a bit surprising that then the network would kind of take the same relaxation dynamic, the same slope, the way it's drawn on this particular slide. That like if it's a short ITI, it ends up further away from that transition point. I could understand that if it didn't know what the ITI was going to be, but I can't fully understand that if it knew what the ITI was going to be, that it wouldn't just let that relax faster. So, do you have any?
Yeah, why doesn't it get all the way there? We have a decent amount of weight decay on the model by design, so that it's like neurons that don't want to work too hard.
Yeah.
I haven't played with turning off the weight decay.
There's obviously some cost to it because if you get moving
Yeah.
too fast in that direction, that could be potentially an issue too. But
Mhm.
it just seems to me like, yeah, I guess that's, just what I said, that it would, that if it knew what
Yeah.
was coming, that it should then manage
I
to
al-
overcome that and get to the right spot.
I think a second part of this that's also important is that they have much less training on these two trial sequences.
Hmm.
So they might not have the amount of training that's necessary to come up with the perfect strategy. Actually, if you keep training them longer, what they do is, if you think of these as like butterfly wings, is they fold in the butterfly wings so that the terminal states during the decision process are right next to each other at the midpoint. And so they fold the task representations into the midpoint. And that was really critical for this design. You know, there's like classic work from the 90s from John Cohen on one way to model cognitive control is that if you have, you know, decision-making recurrent neural networks that are trained to do one task kind of excessively, that if you then have them do something that goes against that, you require some kind of extra stuff in order to overcome that. And so this was kind of his original model of like automaticity and habit learning was overtrained neural networks. That's work from like 1990 or 1992. There's kind of classic stuff there that's really cool. And so this was kind of the inspiration for us to say, well, okay, you've only done a little bit of this switching. What's the kind of first thing that you learn? And we think that's going to maybe involve gating more than it involves completely reconfiguring the task representations. Was kind of our hope for this design.
Kind of relevant to a lot of the things that in the sequence world that we're thinking about. So it's quite, it's quite interesting.
Yeah. And what parts should be overtrained and what parts should be novel.
I have one last question. So when you showed the networks that were trained on two trials, and you showed the similarity of switch or repeat,
Sure.
and you see that there's a positive correlation there.
Yeah.
Do you think it's, I mean, just an idea. So the way I was thinking about it, maybe in a two trial case, the network is developing like a conditional independent signal that is shared between the two types of stimuli. And as we see generally, that explains a lot of the variance. So maybe that's why you see a general positive trend when you
I see. It's like the go signal or something
just the go signal.
In the Churchland papers.
But that kind of condition independent signal doesn't exist for one trial, maybe.
I think it's very different from that mode preparation case, because in the mode preparation case, you know the action that you have to do. Where in this one, you might know the task that you have to do, but you don't know the action. The task is kind of a second order thing. And during the ITI, you don't even know the upcoming task. I think the clearest reason for the similarity is here. We have this shown here is that if you see on a repeat trial versus a switch trial, the dynamics look almost identical between repeat and switch. That's because once you've gone to the midpoint, then the path to the task you have to do is the same. And that's what produces the positive similarity. Where here, if you look at repeat and switch trials, on repeat trials for this network that has not been trained to switch between tasks, it kind of just hangs out in its zone.
Nice.
And when it's switching, it's kind of needs to kind of cross over. And so we think it's that going and having kind of one axis and just going along that axis that produces this negative alignment in the task states.
Thanks. Any other questions? Doesn't seem so. So
right.
one round of applause for John. Thank you, Harrison.
Thanks, Harrison.
Start.
Really interesting.
Thank you.
That was
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.